Hello, hello, everybody.
Paula was just about to do an advertisement for you and you jumped in.
Yeah, I heard your Passover for Dummies. You didn't call it that, but I did. It was very good.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I actually just put the recording of it on Facebook.
Yes, I know. That's where I saw it. That's where I actually saw it.
That's great, great. Paula, I don't know what happened. Apparently, we can't have too much um, uh, um, wisdom in one room because with all three of you, and then I show up, all of a sudden, Paula has
That's
to
it.
Yeah, no. Maybe them, but don't put me
make
in
room
that
for more
category.
wisdom.
Not in that category. I'm only through and through
Paula,
Jewish.
your
That's
microphone
it.
is off.
Oh, mine is off? No,
No,
mine's
Paula,
on.
Paula's.
Oh, Paula's.
Uh-oh.
I hit the wrong button, and that shows how wise I am.
Well, Lisa, you know which button now.
Exactly, exactly.
Wise people don't always do the things right, but they know what they've done wrong and they know how to fix it.
I think there's a compliment in there, so I'll say thank you and let it go.
There's two words in Hebrew. There's the chacham and the pikeach, right? Or as they say in Yiddish, the pikach. Chacham is the wise person, and a pikach is somebody with street smarts, smart.
It's really good to be both. Some people are both.
A canny individual, let's say. Pikach is a canny.
So I had a husband who passed away, and we had 4 children between us. I had a boy and a girl, and he had a boy and girl. And they were all very smart and very good, but my daughter wasn't in the honor classes like the other 3 were. And so she would always complain when she brought her report card, and she'd have A's and B's, she did well. She'd say, but I'm not in the honors class. It's not really A's and B's. And I'd say, of course it is. It wouldn't be if you didn't have it. But my late husband would say, if I picked from the 4 of them, I would pick her to go on an island because she would survive,
No, there's a lot of truth to that. Because there's book smarts and there's street smarts, and each one has its place. And oftentimes when somebody who cruises their way through school on their brain oftentimes are less ready to take on life, But I was just saying that there's the old joke. They say, what's the difference between a chacham and a pikach? What is the difference between the wise one and the canny one? We say that the pikeach could get himself, the canny one, the pikeach could get himself out of situations that the wise one would have never put himself in the first place.
That's really good. That you have to think about.
Yeah.
So there you go. Good Jewish humor that has
That's a good one.
and important messages. Yes. All right. So first of all, before I forget, a plug for tonight. We're going to have a kind of a for the Rebbe's upcoming birthday, the Yud Aleph Nisan, the 11th of Nisan, and the
They've
legacy.
already done all the birthday stuff here.
Oh yeah. Well, we're doing all over here. We're a little later than you guys over in California. But it's 120 years. It's a significant milestone because it's like the culmination of life is 120 years. But we're going to have a Farbrengen with Rabbi Mendel Moskowitz, who is a young fellow, younger than me, Chabad Shliach from Kharkiv, Ukraine. And he's going to share his story. So in a sense, celebrating the Rebbe's legacy by Farbrengen with one of the Rebbe's young heroes, as it were, because that's
Right, who probably didn't ever get to meet the Rebbe.
correct. Or I believe, but too young to have it left a kind of a mental impression, more of a soul connection and the legacy that, and so he'll be joining us. He's calling it my life in a handbag, because that's what it's been reduced to. But again, powerful. So because we're doing this in collaboration with other Chabad centers, it's not going to be on our regular Zoom. So if you would like to participate, you need to go register so we can send you the Zoom link. And that is, go to our website, shalomchabad.com/Ukraine Talk. And then you can register and participate. And I strongly recommend it. First of all, it's it's a good way to come together and celebrate the legacy of the Rebbe. But more importantly, it so much of we're all consuming news on almost a minute to minute basis, if not minute to minute, an hour to hour basis about what's going on in Ukraine. It's nice to be able to hear an empowering story, an inspirational story associated with it, rather than just the general flavor, which is the devastation and the heartbreak and the, in a sense, it makes you question humanity. And so coming from here to hear a positive and uplifting story, I think is just what the doctor ordered. So that's going to happen tonight at 7:30 p.m. Eastern.
Rabbi, can I ask you a really quick question? I had heard that Israel was coming to get the Jews, and that the families were being let out. But then somebody else said, no, the men and the boys have to stay back because they're being conscripted. Is that true?
So the way it works is not Israel's coming to get. Natan Sharansky said it really pretty powerfully and beautifully. He said that till now,
Right. Yeah, that's what I read.
the identifier thing Jew was real trouble, right?
Right.
Now, when you're at the border with all the thousands of people that are trying to get out,
Right.
Jew is your golden ticket. Why? Why is it your golden ticket? Because they're treating the Jews better in Ukraine? No. It's because there's an entire network, there's an entire family of people on the other side that want you. And they're going, and so Israel's not coming to get the Jews, but Israel is welcoming the Jews, and there's a plenty of Jewish organizations. And without patting ourselves on the back, Chabad first and foremost, by a long margin, has created a seamless conduit to get whole communities intact. And I mean, literally, what's amazing about it is we're talking about entire orphanages of 200 kids.
Right.
Being supplanted, literally just picked up
Can hear you.
seamlessly.
Okay.
You hear me?
I know.
Seamlessly dropped back into place in Israel, in Berlin, in Odessa. My cousin, I didn't even know this, but my cousin is a Chabad Shliach in Offenbach, Germany, which is near Frankfurt. It's a pretty big city, but obviously overshadowed by the bigger city, which is Frankfurt. But he kind of wrote to the family. He didn't even, without much fanfare, he says, listen, guys, all the big communities or whatever it is are getting all the attention and therefore all the support. But he says, we've taken in 90 refugees here in Offenbach. That means meals for 90 people 3 times a day, bedding, whatever it is, and not a penny of support.
Oh my goodness.
What he says, if any of you guys, I don't beg from family often, because we're Chabad families and nobody's
Nobody has any money. Right.
the business mogul. But he says until things shake up a bit so that they understand that and get a better sense of we're going to obviously not forsake these people and provide them everything they need, but our resources are incredibly minimal.
Wow.
So
Anyway, so what was the answer to my question about whether or not they're taking Jews out
so the Jews
as families, or whether they're leaving the men and the boys behind?
So many are getting, many Ukrainians are multinationals, which means, especially the Jews, right? Somebody in the family is either, if you're Russian or if you're Israeli, if you have any
Connection,
ability,
right.
then the whole family gets out intact.
Got it.
Oftentimes, but if there's no other, whatever it is, then the men of a particular age range are being kept to support the war effort.
Well, that's good.
What you're saying that they
No,
that
but
they
I mean,
get out?
that most of the Jews were not born there. They're like,
Not most. I wouldn't say most, but
oh, they are born
significant
there?
amount. Significant amount.
Oh.
And also there are other Jewish organizations that are just able to kind of pick up the whole group and take them out, and they're not being filtered through one by one, which helps with
Oh, you mean like the Jewish agency is coming?
the Jewish age, Chabad. Chabad
They've
is
been there, right? And Chabad.
But
But
I
there are other
heard-
Jewish groups besides Chabad.
no. Of
But-
course, there's many. Highest Jewish Agency, the Joint.
No, but I mean Jews who live in Ukraine. Aren't there like breast lovers and all kinds of other like,
Yes, there are others. There are others, but none with as significant as a presence as Chabad.
got it.
But I read that Israel is also taking out Christians. It's not just the Jewish people.
No, I mean all types of refugees are going on to all countries.
And what have we done? That's what really bothers me. We've really not stepped up, I don't think.
Not yet, but I think the United States. I think that we are going to. I think it's right now that you know it's not for lack of places right now. More, it's just at the border, passports and all these things. Right now, Europe and the countries that are driving distance, as it were, or whatever, are really taking the refugees in to a certain
But we have
degree.
them coming over the border and lots of them, and nobody says a word about them coming in here.
No, I
They
don't
should go over to
Interesting,
Mexico.
isn't it?
No. But what I'm saying is, I don't think they're not here because we have a policy in place that we're not taking them. I just think that for right now, the it's they're being taken in the countries that they just drive across the border. I don't know enough about this, but it's a lot bigger of a logistical challenge to get them across the Atlantic Ocean than it is to resettle them. And many of them don't want to go too far away because they're hoping that once this is over, they
Be able to
can
go
go
back,
back.
yeah. Yeah.
What are they going back to? I mean, they've been totally crushed.
Yeah. No, it's heartbreaking to see. So the Jews, for the most part, they're the ones that are looking to pick themselves up because they know they have a better future somewhere else. They know they can pick themselves up and go to Israel or other Jewish established Jewish communities because
It's
really,
interesting because I saw an interview with a rabbi from Ukraine in the beginning, and they were like, we're not going anywhere. We're not moving. I've got 120 Jews that I'm feeding and taking care of, and there's no way. And then like within the week, he left.
because he took
You
the
know, they-
120 Jews out with him.
Maybe.
Yeah, no. Most of these, what they've done is they arranged busloads. Now you have to remember that for us in America, we're not used to the idea of escaping the country, or that concept, which unless it's here, you get into a car and 40 minutes later you're out of the country. In other words, what they did is they took all these Jews in their community, got a hold of buses because I'm saying that's what the incredible network of Chabad has been able to do is allocate resources. So busloads, they left the communities with 4 or 5 busloads worth of people, and they're on the last bus.
Right.
I can tell you something nice.
Hmm.
Before Chabad Bethesda sent out its first appeal for donations for Ukraine aid to Ukrainian Jews, I happened to have gotten an email requesting aid for Ukrainian Jews from the OU. What was nice was that when the OU said in the email, in the solicitation email, how they were getting the money to Ukraine, they said through Chabad.
Hmm.
Oh, that's so
And
nice.
I love that kind of achdut. It makes me very happy.
Yes. No, that's really, and that's the thing, we have to be putting all the differences and all the self-serving, whatever. And now it's really about um, making sure that those that are in harm's way are out of harm's way, and that those that need the support that we provided. And that's really has been the case because Ukraine, if when we'll look back at this, it will be a very tragic period in history, but it will also be incredibly inspirational. Really to take into consideration the fact that you have one really bad actor and millions of good actors. You have Putin, who is just a monster of a human being, and then you have all the rest of the world stepping up in varied degrees. But the truth is that the response has been very powerful and for the most part very positive. I mean, look, even Switzerland came off the sidelines
Really?
Yeah, which is an indication that the world is heading in the right direction. That is very
Yeah, and I'm
true.
so afraid of like isolating Putin and making him feel that the whole world is against him. I mean, I'm just like,
Right, there is danger in that. There's no doubt.
very big.
All right,
Very big.
let's shift focuses and
Okay,
actually
let's.
talk actually about something that will kind of speak a little bit to this general point. This week is Parshat Metzorah. Metzorah is has the title that should have been last week's Torah portion, right? Because last week's Torah portion talked was the first Torah portion and the main one that introduced us to the concept of tzara'at, of this spiritual skin disease.
It's so
And that,
unbelievable. I have to tell you, I've never heard of it before. I've been going to synagogues for years.
Well,
but
what about the kids who had bar mitzvah? This was their portion, and like you had to have heard of it.
so
then.
weird that they would take so much time, effort, energy, and precise, because I was reading while you, and for that. It's just crazy. I know that it's a terrible thing that people should get it because of what they've done, and I get that, but that could have been a paragraph.
Yeah, but this is like an ancient thing.
yeah, no. So that's what I was saying, that this is that this has so much focus in the Torah. Now we're finding out it's not across one Torah portion; it's across two Torah portions. It seems to be that a lot of these relatively obsolete concepts, even like the Mishkan, like all the stuff that is in regular Jewish practice, gets discussed, but get discussed succinctly.
Mhm.
And then the stuff that is kind of not in practice anymore, like the service in the Mishkan, the service in the tabernacle, the vestments of the Kohen Gadol, Tzara'at, etc. These get a tremendous focus and discussion. You can almost say that that's a little bit on purpose, because Shabbat doesn't need the Torah to elaborate on it because it's so much a part of our life. There's so much in the Talmud, et cetera, almost like the Torah says, I don't need to say a lot about this because it will be a major topic of your life every day. But if we don't talk about Sarat, if the Torah does not elaborate on Sarat, there would be no discussion of it, period, because it's not that relevant. So the fact that the Torah doubles down on its discussion is what allows the messages and the lessons of Sarat to remain present in our day-to-day lives. As you said,
Right, it's for us to look
Diane,
for the.
right, Diane, otherwise it could very easily be never discussed and not discussed, period. So the Torah almost compensates, you can say, for knowing that this will not be something that will be in present practice for the majority of Jewish history. That for that reason itself, the Torah chooses to talk a lot about it, because that way the messages will not be lost to history. So you have the Tzara'at. Now, last week we were introduced to the Metzorah. The Metzorah is the individual with Tzara'at, and yet this week is the Torah portion is called Metzorah. Even though we don't talk about the Metzorah is the one who gets Tzara'at. In fact, the way the parsha, the reason why the word exists in the parsha at all is Zot tiyeh Torat HaMetzorah. This shall be the process of the Metzorah, b'yom taharato, on the day that he is no longer a Metzorah, on the day that he becomes pure and healed from the Tzara'at. And then it talks about the process that he goes through on that day to become pure again. And then we're no longer talking about the Metzorah. I'm being very exact. No longer are we talking about the Metzorah. We are still talking about Tzara'at, because we're going to talk about another manifestation of Tzara'at, but not on the person, rendering that person a Metzorah, but on the house.
Remember, I asked at the last second, yeah.
And then I said, hold on, we're going to talk about it next week.
Yeah.
Right? But it's interesting that this week's Torah portion should be the one of talking about the individual who has Tzara'at. That should be the title, when the parsha does not talk about the individual with Tzara'at at all. In fact, it opens up by talking about what happened, the process when this individual is no longer a Metzorah. And if we know that everything is exact in the Torah, then how do we make sense of this? So let's first talk about the last version of Tzaraat, the one that is talked about in this week's parsha. So we said that the last week's Torah portion talked about two versions of Tzaraat, Tzaraat on the individual and Tzaraat on the clothing. The majority of the Torah is about majority of the Torah portion is on Tzaraat on the individual, all the processes, what it looks like, what the procedure would be if you think you have it, having to go to the Kohen, having the Kohen analyze it, what happens when the Kohen declares that it's tamei, what you have to do, etc. And we talked about this all last week.
Right.
The last aliyah and a half talks about Tzaraat on the clothing, and as we mentioned also on leather clothing or clothing that are textile, in other words, woven fabric, how it looks, how it's manifest, all the details of that mentioned in the end of last week's Torah portion. This week's Torah portion begins by talking about the process to become clean, if a Metzorah becomes clean, and then almost in its own little category, we talk about a third manifestation of Tzaraat. After we kind of talked about the end of the process, we kind of go back and then talk about a third version. So after we kind of closed out the conversation by talking about what to do to get over Tzaraat, then we're like, oh, wait a minute, still one more category, let's talk about it. And that is Tzaraat on buildings.
Builders?
Buildings.
Structures,
Building.
houses. Right?
House.
And that, the truth is doesn't talk about it on any other type of buildings except for one type of building, which is a house. In other words, not your place of business, not your rec center, just on abodes, on your domicile. Now, so the fact that it's in its own Torah portion, and after kind of once we close the chapter on the other two, is indicative of the fact that this version of Tzaraat is different than the rest.
Well, the text itself says that Hashem is saying, you go in the land, there's going to be tzaraat in the houses. I'm giving that to you. I love Rashi's explanation, but that's very different.
Good. And Paula, you just said a key word. I'm not even sure you realized the key word that you said. We used a word here. God uses a word that he doesn't use earlier about Tzaraat, which is titnu, asher titnu, that I will give
it. Right.
Give.
That's it.
Right? Which would seem to imply what? When somebody says I'm giving you something, what does that imply?
Well, it sounds like a gift, but really it's
right, a
it's
positive.
the opposite.
Right. A positive thing. I don't give, right? God can afflict us with tzaraat, but he gives us tzaraat. Tzaraat says, like, to a certain degree, you turn around and say, God, with friends like you, right?
Right.
Right. What do you mean you're giving me tzaraat? Right? And the answer is, and this is what the commentaries jump and say, that this version of tzaraat is an entirely different animal. It could be that this tzaraat is similar to the others, which is it's a warning and an indication and a consequence for your bad behavior. But it must mean that. This one, uniquely versus the other two, can also actually be a gift. So let's back up a little bit. The way this would be in the process, along with the others, in terms of your negative consequence for your negative behavior is also a little bit of God's benevolence. Not a little bit, a lot of it, but it speaks to God. It speaks to God's benevolence, because look, most of the time we all slip up. We all slip up. Now, if justice is utterly blind, then when you slip up, there's a consequence, and it's a severe consequence. It's whatever you deserve, right? But as we know, that God does not govern his world with judgment, with midat hadin primarily, but with midat haracham, with his mercy. For this reason, even if you are a bad actor and you did something wrong, God says the consequence is tzarat, but we're going to keep it at a distance. So you get your warning that you're on a bad track, but we don't hit
Wait,
you.
wait, so that on the building, it's a warning that you might get it on your body?
Correct. In other words, it starts to creep closer and closer. Is what the Talmud clarifies. At the beginning, when you are doing this nature, these negative natures of lashon hara and rechilus or matzei shemra, then you don't immediately get it slammed on your body. It first appears on the wall of the house, the most external, as it were, of your possessions. If you still haven't learned your lesson, then it shows up on your clothing. It's a little closer to home. Hopefully by then you have already learned your lesson. If after it appearing on the home and then on the clothing, you still haven't learned your lesson, then it shows up on your skin. And it's not just that when it shows up on your home or on your clothing, it's less, it's further away. It's also less consequential. If it shows up on your home, first of all, automatically, it doesn't get, sometimes with the tzarat on your skin, it can be automatically declared tzarat. On your home, there is always the mandatory 7-day waiting period. So even if it seems to be unequivocally tzarat, the Kohen, when it comes to declaring it on the home, has to do a required 7-day incubation. On the clothing and on the skin, not so. Could be that the Kohen, because it's not definitive, can choose to have a 7-day incubation period, but on the house, it's required. Part of the understanding, as some of the commentaries say, is that even if in fact it is tzarat, which means that you are guilty, God is providing a chance for you to shape yourself up in the next week, over the course of the next week. And by the time the Kohen comes back, he sees it receding and therefore will not declare tzarat.
So wait, but so if you get it on your house, you have to call the Kohen? You can't hide it from the Kohen?
None of them are you allowed to hide it. In fact, if you hide it, God promises that if you are deliberately trying to hide it, it will become worse. It's not worth your while to hide it.
Okay, and everybody who gets it on their body had it on their wall and on their clothing first?
It doesn't say that for sure it happened, but that in general, this would be the process. Could it be that for certain people, it would first, maybe what they've done is so heinous? I can't speak to this. The commentaries don't say that it only goes in this process, but just that there is such a process, that it would first show up on the house, then the clothing, then the thing. But also on the house, it's also, the Torah clearly is promoting leniency when it shows up in the house. Number one, that it has that mandatory incubation period. You cannot declare it tzaras automatically. Number two, the Torah warns as follows. Take all your items out of that room before you call the Kohen in. Because if the Kohen declares it tamei, then the room and anything in it becomes tamei, becomes impure. So the Torah is giving you good advice on how to circumvent the issue. Right? If this is purely a position of judgment, then the Torah shouldn't be advocating for how to mitigate the damage of the consequence. It would be like the judge saying, you're hereby sentenced to 10 years in prison. By the way, bring some good pairs of socks, maybe a little something to butter up the guards, make your life easier. But God is kind of saying this. Before you have the Kohen come, sneak the stuff out, get the stuff out so that the damage will be minimal. There's a general sense that there's an inherent leniency here with showing it up on your house. We want, first, do not declare automatically, get the stuff out in general, which kind of, as we said, and what happens if, God forbid, it turns out to be tzaraat? You don't have to destroy the house, replace the bricks. just replace the part of the wall that the tzaraat is on. So in terms of its damage, is also minimal. When it shows up on the clothing, you have to throw out the whole garment. You have to burn it, in fact. And when it shows up on your skin, that's exile, which is the most severe. So we see that it's not only that it gets closer and closer, but the consequences grow in magnitude. First time around, we're kind of lenient, right? We're giving you warnings. We're giving you an incubation period. We're trying to help you mitigate the damage. Second time, it's not, it's kind of the middle of the road. Whatever you're wearing is destroyed, but it's still not on you yet. It's still just a financial burden. But then if you still haven't learned, that's when severity kicks in. But there's more to the character and nature of the tzaraat on your home that differentiates it from the other versions of tzaraat, which is what validates the fact that God uses the words, and I am giving this to you. I'm giving you the tzaraat. Paula knows where we're going. I think Jerry also knows. Rashi says, what does this mean that God is gifting this tzaraat? Says we have to understand, nowadays, especially in a place like Bethesda, houses go up every 2 minutes, right? You knock down a house, you build a house, right? You make it out of press, particle board, because you know that in 10 years, nobody's going to want to preserve the house. So you're just going to knock down and build another newer version, whatever the modern version sensibility is. Nobody's building houses to last anymore, right? That wasn't always the case. A house was an incredibly expensive, arduous endeavor back in the day. And you built the house out of stone, and the houses lasted for hundreds of years, right? People today in Israel are still living in houses that go back centuries. This is a very foreign idea, to us in America. Nothing goes back centuries here, right? Arrowheads, right? That you dig up in the backyard.
Well, the house that I grew up in was 50 years old when my parents bought it when I was a little girl. And it just was raised because it was a really beautiful lot and it's a beautiful neighborhood. So I'm figuring that's about a century.
Right, but none of them are centuries, right? The most is usually about a century at most, right? Unless you go to places like Virginia or wherever it is, we have historical houses, and people have a bent to leave those up, like in, colonial Williamsburg or what have you. But back in the day, there was an understanding that houses would survive generations, would also survive conquests and population changes. So here's what happened. You had the 7 tribes that lived in Israel, 7 nation tribes.
Canaanite, yeah.
The Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, right? Right, all the ites, the Brooklynites, right? And many of them were aware that the Jewish people are on the way and they're kind of going to bulldoze their way through. But they're not going to be there forever. And so what we're going to do is we're going to come back eventually. So we don't have to take all our treasures with us. We can bury them in the walls of our homes. And when we eventually will come and reconquer the land, we will be able to take it back.
Which goes back to what we just said about how the Ukrainian Jews want to go back.
Right, correct. So,
I mean, they set up synagogues, they have Torahs, they have everything.
right, the whole community. So here you have these Hittites, the Canaanites, et cetera, that are in their mind being forced to flee their home for the duration, but not forever. They don't take all their wealth with them. They can't. They're fleeing. So what they do is they bury in the walls all this gold, silver, and treasure, what have you. So what happens? The Jew moves in, is living in this house, seemingly this innocent structure, doesn't realize that right here in the wall of his living room exists an incredible treasure. So what happens? One day he wakes up and he comes downstairs and he sees a white splotch on his wall. Abrach! Oy, why does this have to happen to me? This is so horrible. This is so terrible. I always have all the rotten luck and and he starts going off and thinks God has it out for me, and my life is terrible, and look at this inconvenience, etc., etc. They call in the Kohen says the incubation period, and he's got to go clear out that room, and he's got to go deal with all this tsaris, and he's just, woe is me, my life stinks, right? And then the moment the Kohen comes, the Kohen looks at him and says, I hate to tell this to you, but it's tsarat. It's tsarat. And that's it. See, I was right. God hates me. My life is miserable and just always suffering all of it. And so he goes and he picks up whatever it is, the hammer, the chisel, whatever, and he starts knocking away at the wall, grumbling the whole time about his miserable luck. And then the piece of the wall falls away, and
Finds the treasure.
Rechush gadol.
Rechush.
ta-da. And that, God says, see, I gifted you. That tsarat. That tsarat helped you discover, right, what you saw as tsaris, and you were so sure was God punishing you, God hating you, and all the things, turns out to be the exact opposite.
How do you reconcile that though with Lashon Hara?
So sometimes, that's what we're saying. That's why this one is unique. This is the only version of tsarat that can come not as a punishment or as a consequence, but rather as a
So the Kohen Gadol knows?
no. As far as the Kohen knows, this is tsarat, and it is tsarat. It's just tsarat for a different reason. The only type of tsarat that could be for a different reason other than the spiritual malady is the tsarat on the house. That's why it's in its own Torah portion. It is in a different volume of the encyclopedia because it could have a different causality. The other
What is the
two,
causality?
that God wants you to discover the treasure.
Okay, so they didn't necessarily have to have sinned before.
Correct.
Oh,
The other two, the only causality for tsarat on the skin, on the skin and tsarat on the garments is your spiritual misconduct. Tsarat on the house could not be a consequence of your spiritual misconduct. It could be caused because God wants you to discover this treasure. But the point is, and here's the point, this whole parsha is called Metzorah. This Torah portion is called Metzorah. Not just last Torah portion, or not even last Torah portion at all. This Torah portion, the one that talks about tsarat having a positive end and a positive purpose, and the tsarat being a manifestation of God's benevolence. The Torah calls this one Metzorah. Why? Because the Torah wants you to know and understand that if you are in that state of being a Metzorah, even this is divine benevolence. like a parent meting out consequence to a child. Of all the people in the world that mete out consequence, you want, if you have to pick, you want your parent to be your parent. Because when they are doing so out of love, out of benevolence to you.
But also, we don't always know. We think something is bad and then it turns out for the good. I brought up,
Correct.
there's a story, there's a parable of the Taoist farmer. Where his horse runs away and then they come back with, everyone says, oh, it's so terrible, you poor guy, what are you gonna do? And then he comes back with 2, and then there's a whole big long, like, in the whole town.
I am familiar with it. So the town says, and they say, how terrible? He says, not necessarily. And then it turns out to be good. And then everybody says, how wonderful. He says, not necessarily. And it turns out to be correct. But we're saying more importantly than that. More important, that was the point of the parsha in and of itself. That sometimes what you see as a negative circumstance is really God just teeing up for you a better result. But by naming it Metzorah, which is the name of the individual who was getting it as a spiritual consequence, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Even that, we have to understand that consequence for your negative action is a benevolent act by God. Is God gifting you this consequence?
I don't know. I'm looking at it in a more pshat way, I guess. My takeaway lesson from the Rashi is sometimes you have to tear down a wall to get to the treasure.
No, Paula, and I'm saying that, and that was what Jerry. I'm 100%, but I'm taking it a step further. Not only are things, when you're looking at negative events in your life, you have to understand sometimes that really this gamzula tova, that this could yield something better. But even more than that, we named this parsha Metzorah. This message is in a Torah portion named Metzorah, which is the individual that is suffering the consequence unequivocally for their negative act. This is not just a random circumstance that you see as negative and we're trying to tell you, no, there could be a positive. What happens when you know the suffering that you're enduring right now is a consequence for your negative behavior? Even that comes the parsha and says the tochen of the parsha is that this is positive, that this is a gift.
So we're supposed to look at it as if God used titnu in all of the circumstances, not just this one.
That God is benevolent and gifting, not only when he is bringing you what seems to be a random negative circumstance, and it could be positive, but even when God is in fact unequivocally meting out consequence for your negative behavior. The Metzorah, somebody who is a Metzorah means on the skin, means you're the Metzorah. And that only comes as a consequence for your negative act. And you say, okay, that's God's judgment. And he is being just and fair in his judgment. Comes the parsha and says, no, it's more than just a consequence of a fair judge. It's actually a gift from a merciful God. This consequence is a gift from a merciful God, as is consequence meted out by a parent. It's a gift.
That's hard.
But think about it.
That's really hard.
You have a child who's misbehaving, right? What is more of a gift? To allow the child to continue misbehaving without any consequence? Or to be the parent that teaches the child, but does so in a way that ultimately has the child's betterment in mind?
So I'm thinking about Rabbi, I forget his name for a second, the one in LA who has ALS and can only move his eyes.
But that's different.
But Rabbi Yitzi says, that's his name, right? He says that he refers to the gift of ALS.
But you see, that's the first point. That is where a random negative circumstance. This is even when you know for a fact that
That you did something.
Consequence for negative behavior, like Metzorah.
So it's not Sadik Viralo. It's
correct. You know this case. That's why we're saying the parsha is called Metzorah. A
Right.
Metzorah can only become a Metzorah because as a consequence for their negative behavior.
Right.
Not like the Tzarat on the house. Metzorah is an individual who has Tzarat on their skin unequivocally because of something they did. Still, this is the title of the parsha when we're talking about the version of Tzarat that is benevolent. Because we're trying to make the point that even the Tzarat that comes as a consequence for your negative behavior is also benevolent. Because when God metes out consequence for your negative behavior, he is doing this from his benevolent side, not from judgment.
So is it sort of like a push to do tshuva?
Correct?
Oh,
It's
okay.
rehabilitative. It's correctional.
Okay.
You know that once upon a time, we had the same approach to our consequences that we meted out here in the United States, which is why we call these facilities correctional facilities. And we call it that the um, blanking on the word. Another one of the words that connotes that the point is not to punish the criminal,
Rehabilitate something with rehabilitation.
but the point, the purpose is rehabilitation, which is a gift for the wayward. The rumble strips on the highway are not there to punish you. They are a service to tell you that you're veering off the proper course, and to shake you out of your complacency and have you do something about it. To understand by naming this Torah portion, this one, the one that talks about God's benevolence in the Tzara, by naming this Torah portion, Metzorah, the version of Tzara that can only be understood as a consequence, is to make the point that even that version of Tzara is also God's benevolence. When a parent punishes a child, if, and parents are not perfect, right? So sometimes we get this wrong, but God is perfect. Every version of God's punishment, God's consequence, is an act of benevolence on his part. It pushes a person to do tshuva, or perhaps more importantly, as the Rambam lays out, that a person suffering consequence in this world is to spare them from having to suffer their consequence in the world to come, which is infinitely more real, infinitely more impactful, infinitely longer in span. The point being, this is a very important paradigm that the Torah is telling us in general about God and his relationship with wrongdoers.
This is like the definition of leap of faith for me. It's going to take me a while to process this. This is big.
This is very big, but it's also very important to understand that. And in fact, it's what God demands of us to employ in our version of crime and consequence. In the Commonwealth of Israel, when we had a system, a justice system established, all parts of it were in terms of the consequence aspect of it, were done so with the criminal in mind, not the victim. Not that the victim should be able to have their revenge, as it were, but rather the rehabilitation of the criminal, or the criminal's undying soul. And again, as we said, that this was originally the approach of the American system. Do you know, for example, right now, our main mode of consequence is incarceration, right? Why do we do this? Do we do this so that the criminal becomes a better human being?
No, so he gets off the street and doesn't do it to somebody else.
Correct.
Right.
Originally, the approach was, in naming it a correctional facility, was to rehabilitate the criminal and do so in a way where they are, in fact, not near other human beings. So that's why we did it. in the confines of a correctional, of a closed off facility. But there was a serious amount of time and effort invested in rehabilitating the criminal. Nowadays, there's a nearly 70% recidivism rate. We've given up on that. And that's, as far as Yiddishkeit is concerned, unacceptable. We just are basically throwing away the prisoner for as long as we can. But we're not trying to do anything to rehabilitate them. So
But don't we see this today, that we have riots and things that, that's
because
not
it's actually counterproductive.
Yeah.
Instead of investing in trying to educate and trying to rehabilitate and trying to the criminal, we're just throwing them into prison with this kind of band-aid solution of just get them off the streets for as long as we can, and then we put them back on the streets, and we haven't rehabilitated the criminal. So the vast statistical likelihood is that this guy's going to do it again, and then we're going to arrest him again and throw him into prison for as long as, rather than working and actually trying to rehabilitate this person because to a certain degree, we have lost that general sense that every human being has a spark of God in them. And it's only the rare few that are Hitlers and Putins.
That reminds me of Rabbi Manis Friedman started a YouTube, and he said, what is this Black Lives Matter business? Black Lives Matter? Every life is sacred.
Right.
Yeah, he'd get beat up for that.
Of course, but he didn't.
The point is, he's saying further, not only that he has a problem with them singling out Black lives, but he's saying it's not that they matter, they're sacred. Life is sacred.
Right.
And this is what's key. So the Torah is telling you, God is not taking revenge on you when he's punishing you. He's not even punishing you. He's meting out consequence with who in mind? With you in mind. Tzaraat is there to make you a better person. Go into exile, have meditation, think about the consequence of your action, and you're going to come back when you're a better human being, more sensitive human being, more caring human being. That's an act of benevolence. That's an act of benevolence. That's a gift.
I don't know. My husband used to work in prisons. He did volunteer work. And what he was doing was tutoring in math for prisoners. Very laudable, my husband's he's wonderful. But that's not why I'm saying this. Going into exile for 7 days or however many days to think about it, to meditate on it, I'm not sure is going to have as good an outcome as doing something concrete or guiding the person.
Guiding
I think
the
that
person.
they should give them an opportunity to learn a trade or to do something with themselves.
We're not talking about, don't forget, we're not talking about somebody who is doing petty crime and smashing grabs.
Right. The reason Shona Ra is like a spiritual
this guy probably has a trade and all that. We're talking about
That's a good point, Jerry. That's a great point. Thank you for
Sorry,
reminding
Rabbi.
me that.
I'm such an interrupter.
No,
but I said that the Shona Ra is a spiritual problem. So
correct.
It can't hurt other people, but it's basically a spiritual problem. So
it's a character issue.
Meditate.
It's important to remember that.
But on your point in terms of the counseling, don't forget, what did we say last week? They don't go and get this declared by a judge. They get this declared by what?
The Kohen.
A Kohen who now feels personally responsible for this person, who is going to be exactly that, the person who will go out and counsel this individual. But in general, don't just think about Tzaraat. The general idea, oftentimes when you're on the receiving end of consequence, even when you know that you deserve it, your general attitude is that it's fair. It's fair. It's fair. I did something wrong. I deserve something wrong to happen to me. That is a wrong attitude. You did something wrong. You don't deserve to have something wrong happen to you. You deserve that something right should happen to you that makes you right, that makes you a better person.
But going
That's
away and putting them in prison doesn't help them with that
correct.
because,
That's why Torah doesn't have prison as one of its
We're
concepts.
not talking about that. We're talking about Lashon Hara.
We're not only talking about Lashon Hara, we're talking about in general. God metes out consequence. Your
For
attitude has to
wrongdoing.
be, your attitude has to be not that God, okay, I deserve that God is taking revenge, but rather I need to grow from this. I need to come out on the other end of this a better human being. That's my responsibility. I am responsible to have the perspective that uh, when I am receiving the consequence for my negative action, I shouldn't. When a parent punishes a parent doesn't want the child to A, feel that the parent was not fair. B, they don't even want to feel that they don't want that the child should feel that the parent was fair. They want more than that. What does a parent want from the child when they are receiving their consequence? To learn from this. Have you
right,
learned?
to understand
Have you
what happened.
grown? I.e., this is an act of benevolence from a parent to a
But I
child.
see that like in AA, you have people that, are very addicted and they go to AA and then they get a sponsor and they work hard together to overcome that. And I can understand that because they're learning from that.
Correct? That's
But
part of the rehabilitative process. But you know what oftentimes is the thing, how did they get into the AA in the first place?
through somebody that cares,
Oh,
through somebody that
through an
said,
intervention.
right, an intervention.
Sometimes the intervention is somebody coming over and knocking on your door, and sometimes the intervention is a circumstance that knocks on your door.
Mhm.
The point being that what we have to understand about God's consequences is that they're not there to punish you. They're there to shake you out of their complacency with your negative behavior. When a parent punishes a child, it's because they understand that if they don't punish the child is not going to know that this behavior is not okay.
Right, right.
They are gifting that child with this information, with this understanding.
Rabbi, I understand all that, but let's get back to the exile for the people who commit Lashon Hara. Considering the fact that probably 90% of people gossip, you're going to have all the gossips together in exile. And what are they going to do?
Not together.
They're going
Not
to
together.
gossip with each other.
They're not allowed to be together.
So if they're not allowed to be together and we want to put this on modern times, maybe the sentence should be 7 days of solitary confinement.
Except today, because unfortunately we have not engaged in as much soul rehabilitation as we should, this terrible crime is so ubiquitous as to, we would have to start in a whole different place. Back then, people were a lot more sensitive of not speaking Lashon Hara for this very reason, because the consequences were so real and so apparent that you didn't have 90% of the people gossiping. You had a far healthier society because God gifted the society with proper consequence. And so the society was in a better place. That's the point. Consequence is not just fair and just. Consequence is good. A parent who wants the best for their child wants consequence. That's the point. Again, without going specifically into the Metzorah, we can do it, but I want to broaden it out beyond Metzorah. When God metes out consequence, it's for your own good. It's a benevolent act. Now, God is perfect, so he's always perfectly calibrated. We as parents oftentimes are not. Sometimes we mete out our consequence when we're not in the right frame of mind. And in that case, that's exactly the point that this parsha is teaching us. Don't you dare mete out consequence if it's not going to be a benevolent act. If you're going to mete out consequence as revenge, or even as what you feel is just, then you're missing a key ingredient in all consequence. God wants you to follow in his ways. And when God metes out consequence, it is a benevolent act. Can you say that about every time you mete out consequence?
Mm-mm.
And this is why the Torah actually demands that if you're going to punish a child, the Torah does not mind corporal punishment, but never in anger. Never in anger. Slapping your child might in fact be the right thing to do, but never in anger. The point being, God is teaching us a very important paradigm to consequence. Consequences from proper consequence. It's not just fair, it's not just, it's also benevolent. It's also a service and a gift to the criminal, because it has to be done and calibrated as such to give them the chance to be a better person. Now, again, the choice still remains with that individual. The person has free choice. Do they take this gift and use it properly, or do they ignore it or abuse it, et cetera, et cetera? But you, as the one who mitigating, or the one who is meting out the consequence, has to be godlike in your approach, which is that you have to make sure that your consequence is satisfying a checklist that includes not just that it's fair and it's just, but also that it is benevolent, that it is done with the growth of the criminal in mind.
The criminal has to, at the outset, though, admit to himself in a deep way that he wants to be better.
Not that he should,
otherwise.
he should, but as we said, free choice. God gives people things and they abuse it. That doesn't change that you have to, whether the criminal is going to do his part or her part in this is very much up to them. They are a person with free will as you are. But you have to do your end of the deal. No matter what that guy ends up doing on his end of the deal, you have to do your end of the deal. You need to be calibrating your consequence in a way that it is not just fair and just, but it's also benevolent. Having said that, do you say, oh, I'm only going to do that if the criminal is going to properly receive it? You do what you have to do. Hopefully you're doing so in a way that the criminal, you make it easy for the criminal to rise to the occasion. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. That does not absolve you of your responsibility to do it right. And also, more importantly, if you're in the position of the criminal, the one who is receiving the consequence, you're also responsible to have the perspective that God is not bad, or even that God is just and I deserve that this bad thing should happen. God says, I want you to understand deeper than that. I'm not bringing a bad thing on you for the sake of taking revenge or balancing scales. This is happening so that you can grow from it. Take this for what it is. As a parent also, a parent meets out a consequence and then always turns around to the child or hopefully should always around to the child and say, did you learn your lesson? What do those words mean? Do you understand how this is a benevolent act with a lesson in it? I'm not here simply to take revenge. There's no lesson in that. This is a benevolent act. This is meant to be a growth process. And I, as a parent, am invested in you learning that and hearing that and understanding that, as is God. Every act of consequence from God is an act of benevolence. And we should strive that it should be the same as well. To perceive it as such when we are on the receiving end of consequence, and to calibrate our consequence as such when we are on the giving end of consequence.
Wow.
It is, and I say, it's a very important philosophical, but you will see that thread runs through when you look at the various consequences and the way that we in the Commonwealth of Israel with the Sanhedrin meted out consequence. It was very much with this approach.
Right, but nowadays, we don't have Tzarath and we don't have the Sanhedrin. So what we get is man's punishment.
Correct. And man's punishment, unfortunately, is not as properly, but that doesn't change the fact that when you are in the position of having to mete out consequence, you have to take this into consideration.
Right, but in terms of the lesson taker.
Okay, so the
Like I
lesson
was thinking
taken,
about, who was that guy who was in jail for 8 years, the Jew?
well,
What's his
Rabbi,
name? The,
what's the name? Rabashkin.
you know, that the butcher,
Oh,
the
Rabashkin.
guy,
Rabashkin.
Rabashkin.
Yes,
Okay, now Rabashkin didn't once say, I'm sure, oh, God is doing this for my benefit.
he
No,
actually, no, he did in fact say that. In fact, as you read in
Ah,
his book that carried him through, Faith Under Fire is the name of his book. And it's exactly that point. That's what
wow.
got him through.
he looked at it that way.
He looked at, we always look in every act, Gamzula Tova. This too is for the good. Maybe for the good in the sense that something better is coming down the pike. Maybe for the good in the fact that I need to learn a lesson from this. That's the point. Everything's for the good. Sometimes the good is that something better is, that this is bad, but it's leading to good. And sometimes is that this bad is good because right now I need to learn from this bad.
Right, somebody recently said, you shouldn't look at things as happening to you, you should look at things as happening for you.
Correct.
It just doesn't always work. I'm sorry.
No.
Not that it doesn't always work.
A
Sometimes
parent abuses a child.
Right, he was
All
saying.
of
the
this goes
parents-
out the window.
Right,
Paula, so what we have to remember is at the end of the day, that we don't always know why. That is 100% true. And we're never going to understand why, like the Holocaust, et cetera, et cetera. But this is still God's world.
but I would hate to think that somebody was looking at the Holocaust and thinking, oh, what's this mean, and what can I
No,
take
so
from
that's what
it?
we don't say what this means. You don't say about somebody else's suffering what that means. You don't decide
Right.
for somebody else. For yourself, you can always be in a position of empowerment to say, okay,
What
I
can I
can
learn?
do something with this. I'm not just a victim of circumstance. I can do something with this. Okay, it's a longer conversation, obviously, and there's so much to talk about it, but we do have to go. So we'll pick this up next week.
Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Yeah,
Rabbi,
you're on.
very much.
Again,
So-
please join us tonight. It's going to be very fascinating and important to come and kind of use this as an opportunity to celebrate the Rebbe's birthday. So shalomchabad.com/Ukraine talk. Shalomchabad.com/Ukraine talk, and come hear from Mendel Moskowitz. And also look for him if he pitches it strongly enough, everybody can support his efforts as well because he's currently coordinating relief efforts for tens and tens of families, if not hundreds of families. So so there's that as well. Either way, please join us. We want to have a nice showing coming. So shalomchabad.com/Ukraine talk. All right, everybody?
Thank you,
Thank you,
Rabbi. Have a
Rabbi.
good
Thank you
Shabbat.
so
I've got a conflict tonight, so I won't be doing it, but stay well, and I'll see you on Shabbos, IYH.
All right.
And I will go give money.
All right. Okay. Call to everybody.
Bye.